September 28th, 1972, exactly 45 years ago today, Paul Henderson scored one of the most iconic goals in Canadian hockey history. It was Game 8 of the Summit Series between Canada and the Soviet Union in Moscow. 34 seconds left when Henderson scored that goal that gave Canada a series victory. It wasn't supposed to be that close, but boy was it. Tonight, in conversation with Roy MacSkimming, author of the book Cold War, which tells the hockey and political story around that series. So welcome to Pembroke, Roy.
Thank you very much, Jamie. Good to be here.
Let's start off with how the series came to be.
Well, there have to be two sides wanting the same thing to make an event as big as this happen. And just to set the stage for a moment, I think you have to realize something that would not be apparent today. But in 1972, there were two separate universes of hockey. There was international hockey, which culminated every year in the World Championship Series, and every fourth year that was the Olympic Series. And it was played by national teams from throughout Europe and totally dominated by the Soviet Union. Since the year 1954, they had won the great majority of world championships, and they had gradually built up a team that played together all year and lived together, and they were professionals in fact, but not in name. So it was supposedly an amateur universe, and over in North America, you had the professional universe of the NHL and all the farm teams, the senior and junior leagues that fed into the NHL. And they played a different style of hockey, much rougher and tougher. And of course, that, as far as we were concerned, living in Canada in 1972, that was the real game. These were the really greatest players in the world, and all those amateurs over there were just, having fun. Canada did have a national team for a few years in the 60s, and it was made up of college players. It was coached by David Bauer, Father David Bauer, who was a very well-regarded coach, and they trained hard and they tried to do as well as they could, but they could never win the gold. It was always the Soviets and occasionally the Czechs who'd win the gold. So there was a feeling that this, in the old days, way before this period, Canada had always won the World Championships. But now that the Soviets were so strong and so dominant, we just weren't winning anymore. And there was a feeling among the Canadian professionals that if it ever came to that, they'd beat these Russians easily. The Russians, meanwhile, had a different idea. They felt that they had raised their game to the point where they were winning. They had nothing left to prove in the amateur sphere. They wanted to prove themselves against the Canadian professionals. And they mostly were Canadians in those days. There were a few Americans and the odd Swede in the NHL, but they were mainly Canadian players. And so, gradually, feelers were put out by both governments. The Trudeau government of the day was interested in closer relations with the Soviet Union to try and ratchet down the tensions of the Cold War, and they thought that hockey diplomacy was one way to bring the two worlds together. And the Russians, they planted a story in Izvestia, the newspaper of the Communist Party, and of course the Soviet Union was tightly controlled by that party, hinting that they were ready to consider a series of exhibition games against the NHL. So that hint was picked up by Canadian diplomats, and they sent the message back to Ottawa, yeah, these guys are ready now. So it had to be a political decision, because the Soviet Union was the enemy In those days of the Cold War, it's hard to imagine now, but you know, it wasn't a normal thing, and it had never happened before to see these two hockey worlds come together. And there was an organization called Hockey Canada, which had just been created to try and make all this happen. And there was a guy on the board of Hockey Canada who was there because he was the head of the new NHL Players Association, and that was Alan Eagleson, who was an agent for many of the players.
Including Bobby Orr.
Yeah, Bobby Orr was his biggest, most famous, and most highly paid client. And Eagleson quickly kind of took over. He kind of picked up the ball and ran with it, and became the point man for organizing the Canadian team. The first thing he needed was a coach, obviously, and so they could start selecting an all-star team. And the man he chose was, the man he invited was Harry Sinden, who had already done good things as a coach in the NHL, but was at the time unemployed. So Harry was ready and willing to take on the job.
And he brought in John Ferguson, who had just recently retired from the Montreal Canadiens. In fact, they thought about maybe having Fergie play. That didn't happen, but Ferguson joined Sinden.
John Ferguson, yeah, the tough guy from the Montreal Canadiens who had a great career.
So we get an idea. Alan Eagleson gets involved, and they decide they're going to play this series of 8 games, 4 in Canada, 4 in the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. And most Canadians think, walk in the park. Lots of journalists think Canada will sweep the series. Well, maybe the Soviets might win one. There's the odd dissenter, but if you're a dissenter, you're really put in an outcast role. There's the journalist in Montreal who says, be careful, Canada. It might not work out this way. But for the most part, Canadians are saying this is going to be a walk in the park.
But Canadians were really paying attention. This was big news. And part of the build-up to this series had been Weekend Magazine running a poll and asking its readers if they wanted to see a series like this. 99% said yes. People had been waiting for this confrontation, this showdown between the two great hockey powers. And Canadians were just rubbing their hands, looking forward to, you know, the beating that our guys were going to give the Russians, because it was going to really put them in their place, and it would not only be a hockey victory, but also be a political victory, because people were still pretty indoctrinated in those days to think that our system of government and our way of running the economy, free enterprise, was the best and the natural order of things, along with democratic government, and that the Soviet communist system was essentially, some people called it evil, or at least, at the very least, it regimented its population. It didn't allow freedom of speech and so on. So there was a feeling that if we could beat them on the ice, it would just prove once again the superiority of our way of life. And that I know that seems simplistic, but that was the popular mood, and it was certainly a mood that was reinforced by the media. And as Jamie says, virtually every hockey writer and expert who was asked, or who wrote a column about it, said Canada will sweep all 8 games, or maybe the Russians will take 1 and tie 1 at the best. And there was this one guy for the Montreal Star, John Robertson, who said, "Hey, you're you know, it's not going to be that easy." And he was practically accused of being unpatriotic and attacked by his own readers.
A couple of footnotes before we show the first game action from Game 1. That is, 1972 is also the start of the World Hockey Association, which is the new competitor to the National Hockey League. Mm-hmm. And the first big splash is Bobby Hull, Chicago Blackhawks, who goes and signs with the Winnipeg Jets. And as a result of that, he's squeezed out of the Summit Series.
Yeah, and that's something that really bothers people, that Bobby Hull at that point is considered the along with Orr, the best player in the NHL, certainly the most potent scorer, goal scorer. And it's taken so seriously by people that Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, father of our current Prime Minister, writes a letter to the NHL president, Clarence Campbell, asking him, you know, he can't very well order him, but asking him to let Bobby Hull play because Canada deserves to be represented by its best players, even if they've jumped ship and gone over to the rival league. And Campbell says, no way, no, our owners will not allow our players to play unless it's NHL players only.
So Hull squeezed out. The other bad news is Bobby Orr is really starting to feel the impact of knee injuries, and he is on the roster, but he never sees a shift in the series.
No,
at the time, the
world's
world's greatest player.
over there.
Yeah, the world's greatest player. You're right. It's on display here through the Hockey Hall of Fame.
He never wore it.
Which is a real shame. So, despite all of that introduction, and you know, Canadians feeling pretty confident about the series, the first couple of minutes of the game, Game 1, Montreal, Labor Day weekend, 1972.
Yep.
I would say that Canadians probably thought we were right. It's going to be a walk in the park. So let's have a look at the first clip. This is early in the game, Montreal Forum, Labor Day weekend, Game 1. Here's how it started.
Benoit moved out of position there for the start, and the face-off, and the game is underway with Petrov having cleared it into the Canadian zone. Canada clear on the boards, but not out. It's Bergman coming up now with a pass to center ice. Esposito going up over the line into the corner, shot right across the goal line. Bergman keeps it in. Nahavlich missed it back of the net. There's Benoit. There's a pass with Lino. Big stop. Here's a shot right front. Let it go! Nahavlich knocked it into the net.
Now, the first thing you probably notice about that, there's no HD. So for those of you who are younger in the audience, that's the way television looked in 1972, and the audio wasn't very great either. The voice, however, a name that you may know, certainly those that are older in the crowd, is Foster Hewitt. And Foster Hewitt came out of retirement to call this series with Brian Conacher, who had some European hockey experience. He was the color commentator. That goal, 35 seconds into Game 1. And then there was another goal that made it 2-0 Canada within the first 6 minutes. And it was downhill from there.
But when it was 2-0, people thought, my God, what will the score end up being? You know, will they run it up into the double digits? It just seemed like all the fantasies that Canadian hockey fans had been indulging were coming true, you know, right at the beginning of Game 1.
The reality is, though, the Canadian players in the dressing room after the first period are saying to each other, we're in trouble. These Soviets are in really good shape. We're not. The NHL in those days, let's just say there were a lot of barbecues in the summer, and there were beverages served at those barbecues, and they were out of shape. Quite frankly, well, they weren't ready to play.
That's really a key point. The NHL did not have the custom in 1972 of making sure the players stayed in shape over the summer. They didn't do off-season conditioning. You know, the most they would do is go fishing or play golf for exercise. But they typically arrived at training camp in September, 10 to 20 pounds overweight, and having to work it off in the weight room. And they would just generally, you know, they'd play exhibition games, and they would have to play themselves into shape. And that was just the customary way that the NHL had always done things. And like so many other things, they didn't see why they should be any different in preparing for this series against the Soviets, who, on the other hand, were in superb shape because they trained and played all year round. And when they weren't playing hockey, in the warm weather, they played soccer, volleyball, basketball. They ran on sand. They did weights. You know, they were in perfect physical condition. And so, yeah, we were ahead at the end of the first period, but we were not ahead in other ways. We were running out of steam already.
Well, watch here. This is the last goal of Game 1. Alexander Yakushev, third period, and you can just watch this clip, and you can just see that Canada's just lethargic. They're not even in the game. So this is Yakushev essentially stunning an already stunned Montreal form.
He was the Soviets' top goal scorer.
In a tremendous hockey game here, the first of a series that promises to be sensational. Now Lapointe goes up, getting in close, right in. And again, that Tretiak was steady and covered the angle. Down the left side for Zeman. Zeman, number 11, gets it back to Yakushev, who's knocked down. Puck is on the boards with Henderson losing it to Chadron. A roller right in front. They score! Yakushev cutting right in front to make it 7-3.
7-3, and that's how game one ends. And you can imagine what the Canadian newspapers looked like the next morning, and what the coffee talk or water cooler talk was the next morning. Canada was stunned.
Oh yeah, the headlines were Canada humiliated. It was seen as a national tragedy, as an embarrassment. People just couldn't believe it. It was as if their most cherished belief had just been proven false, because the Soviets had outplayed the best of the NHL so thoroughly. 7-3. That's pretty bad. So people were really demoralized and upset, and wondered if what was going to happen. There were 7 more games to go.
And Harry Sinden and John Ferguson, already they are starting to feel the heat. The pressure is now on. They've been blown out in Game 1 in Montreal. Game 2 is going to be Maple Leaf Gardens in Toronto. Sidebar is that Harold Ballard, the longtime owner of the Toronto Maple Leafs, Bobby Orr, the NHL superstar, and Alan Eagleson actually cut a deal to get the broadcast rights to the series. It's called Ballard Orr Productions. And they knew there were going to be millions of people watching. It was a chance to make money. So that's kind of just an interesting little side piece. Going into the game in Toronto, Sinden and Ferguson are playing with the Lions. Sinden had made a promise to every Canadian, you will get the chance to play in this series.
And there were 35 players selected, so that's almost 2 full teams.
And it came back to burn them in some respects, and later led to some dissension when players weren't being brought into the lineup. But let's go to Game 2. Canada's feeling the heat. This is the only win they end up getting on Canadian soil. It's a 4-1 win. Here's a quick clip. This is a goal that some of you may have seen. It was a goal that has been replayed many, many times. Pete Mahovlich, it's 2-1 Canada at the time, 6:47 third period, and it's a shorthanded marker. Here it is.
Lapointe is on the defense. Peter Mahovlich remains out there. There's a pass back to Liapkin over on the far side. That crisscross passing play. They fail to click on that one. Now Chadron getting it back to Liapkin. Over on the far side, right in front of the goal, went wide of the net. Jamie knocks it back to the goal and goes off to the side. They fail to clear it out. Lapointe failed to get it away. Then after being cleared out, it's a race down with Peter Mahovlich going in on goal. Right in!
In 1972, that was crashing the net, going right in on Tretiak. And Tretiak is an interesting story. The Soviets weren't, he's 20 years old. The Soviets aren't convinced he's the right guy that can win this series for them, but he opens everybody's eyes because he's spectacular.
Well, and he's a big surprise to the Canadians. The Soviets had scouts coming over to Canada, and they watched game films. They had a book on every player on the Canadian team. So they knew what to expect, and they tried to analyze the strengths and weaknesses of the individual players and the overall strategy that they used. But the Canadians knew next to nothing about the Soviet players, except that 2 Toronto Maple Leaf scouts had gone over and watched a couple of games in Moscow just before the series started. And they saw Tretiak in goal for the Red Army playing against another team, and he was really terrible. He led in 8 goals in that game, and they came back and reported to Harry Sinden that this kid Tretiak they're going to put in goal. He's he's easy to beat. You know, he doesn't have a good glove hand. He's slow. He's tall and gangly and awkward. And what they didn't realize was that Tretiak was getting married, and his buddies had taken him out the night before for the big night before the wedding, and he was playing with the worst hangover of his life. Some would say this, the Canadian Scouts were set up.
And yeah, we're going to get into the whole spy, suspicion, paranoia. Once they get over to Moscow, it gets actually quite bizarre. But they go into Game 3, they're feeling a lot better. Interesting, I always found this interesting. The choice of Game 3 is Winnipeg. There were only 3 Canadian teams in the NHL at that time. Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver has only been in for 2 years. Winnipeg is the epicenter of the World Hockey Association, where Bobby Hull now plays, and it gets chosen as the location for Game 3, and the Winnipeg fans not very happy because Hull isn't in the lineup. And Canada blows a lead. They have a 4-2 lead in this game. It ends up in a 4-4 tie, and Pete Mahovlich scored shorthanded in Game 2, while Valery Harlamov scores shorthanded in this game, and we're going to talk about Harlamov right after we watch this clip from Game 3, 4-4 tie.
7:50 left in the second period. 50 seconds left in the penalty to the Soviet. Mahovlich dropping in on that left wing. Centered out to Esposito, and he tried to putt that one and just failed to get it. Another try now. The puck goes off the legs after Mahovlich has had a try. Stapleton at the blue line to Mahovlich. Mahovlich took a shot as Barnoyer tried to rush in for the rebound, which didn't occur. Brad Park is forced into the corner. Lachenko covers him. Barnoyer comes out in front. Rolled one near the goal. Tretiak is trying to see it. Mahovlich is chased into the corner by Sagankov. They center it out, and Harlamov goes racing away on a breakaway. Coming in on goal. He shoots, he scores! Harlamov came out from nowhere there to draw the
Valery Harlamov is the best player on the Soviet Union team, and Canada is now getting a taste of him, and they don't like it.
Well, Harlamov explodes a myth that Canadians had entertained about the Soviet players, which was that they were robots, that they were trained to play a system of hockey that was kind of mechanized, that was nobody was encouraged to be creative or to do anything outstanding. You know, that they would pass and work the puck in until they could get a good shot, and it was all teamwork and no individualism. And Harlamov was the first player to really show how untrue that was, because he was extremely creative with the puck, as you could see in that clip. He could, if they would try and break him loose, and they did there, and he could. In Game 1, he scored 2 goals in the second period, in which he basically went all the way around, and in one case, and between in the other case, the Canadian defenseman. You know, he was just very fast and had very fantastic hands and puck control, and he really was turning out to be the most dangerous player on the Soviet attack.
So in a series that was supposed to be a sweep, 3 games in, Canada has a win, a loss, and a tie. And now they're going to Vancouver, and Vancouver does not go well. The Canadians end up losing that game 5-2. That after Sinden felt his team actually played very well in Game 2 and 3. They got a win and a tie out of that. In Vancouver, they come out flat. And there's also this revolving door between Ken Dryden and Tony Esposito. Who should we put in net? Neither has been spectacular.
Well, Dryden was the victim in Game 1. Esposito, Tony, was in for the win in Game 2. They too were rusty. They were very rusty. They hadn't been playing for a long time. The Vancouver game, though, was I think some of the lines hadn't gelled yet, and Sinden had been juggling lines. He'd been trying to find the right combination. The only line that stayed together for the whole series was the one composed of Paul Henderson, Bobby Clark, and Ron Ellis. and they were consistently good. But even by Game 4, the team was still floundering.
And all of that frustration from Canadian hockey fans bubbles over in Vancouver. The team is booed loudly at the old Pacific Coliseum in Vancouver after they lose 5-2. And that sets up perhaps one of the greatest speeches in Canadian sport history, and more of a sermon from the pulpit, I would say. And this is Phil Esposito, who is the leader of the Canadian team, and he is very angry when he is interviewed by Johnny Esau right after Game 4. Have a look.
He was hoping he'd be chosen the game star for Canada, because he was going to use that opportunity when he was interviewed to give the fans a piece of his mind for the way his team was being treated. And this is truly a great speech, and I quoted it in full in my book because I thought it was so incredible that he's so articulate, and so dramatic, and Esposito was he was the team leader. And he really showed it in this moment.
Well, let's have a look. Here's Phil Esposito, very mad.
For the people across Canada, we tried. We did our best. And for the people that boo us, geez, all of us guys are really disheartened, and we're disillusioned, and we're disappointed in some of the people. We cannot believe the bad press we've got, the booing we've gotten in our own buildings. And if the Russians boo their players, if the Russians boo their players like some of the Canadian fans, I'm not saying all of them, some of them booed us, then I'll come back and I'll apologize to each one of the Canadians, but I don't think they will. I'm really disappointed. I am completely disappointed. I cannot believe it. Some of our guys are really down in the dumps. We know, we're trying, but hell, I mean, we're doing the best we can, and they got a good team, and let's face facts. But it doesn't mean that we're not giving it our 150%, because we certainly are.
And I think, Phil, the disappointment is a natural thing, because the whole thing was an unexpected thing. We all live with the National Hockey League. We've all been so proud over the years how great they are.
It's unexpected because of the press said that we were so good. Or not one of us said we were good.
No, this is the thing. This is the thing that I'm, on behalf of the fans, I must say that probably, since everything is relative, we know how good you people are. The people didn't realize how good the Soviet team was, and now we found out how good they are. I think we can appreciate how good both teams are.
But I'll tell you, we love, I mean, every one of us guys, 35 guys that came out and played for Team Canada, we did it because we love our country, and not for any other reason, no other reason. They can throw the money for the pension fund out the window, they can throw anything they want out the window. We came because we love Canada. And even though we play in the United States and we earn money in the United States, Canada is still our home, and that's the only reason we come. And I don't think it's fair that we should be booed.
Well, Phil, I'm sure that the people can see from these sweat just pouring off your face that you and all your players have given 100%, and we look forward to some great games from you and the rest of your gang when you get over to Moscow, and we can wish you the very best of luck.
John,
keep working hard.
We're going to get better.
Attaboy. Thank you very much, Phil.
Classic Phil Esposito. For those who don't know, Espo was a prolific goal scorer, 76 goals in one season, which was a high mark in the NHL in those days, in the early 70s for the Boston Bruins, playing with an illustrious teammate in Bobby Orr. But Esposito spoke from the heart in that moment and took that message with him, halfway around the world to the Soviet Union, where Game 5 would be set up. But before they get to Game 5, there's a couple of exhibition games in Sweden, and that's really when the team starts to gel.
Yeah, when the team leaves Canada to go to Europe, they're going to prepare for the 4 games in Moscow. The Russian games won't be moved from city to city like the Canadian games were. They'll all be played in the old Luzhniki Sports Palace in Moscow. And but the Canadians have scheduled some time in Sweden to help them adjust to the larger ice surface and to the international style of refereeing as well. There'll be European officials doing the series in Moscow. In the games in Canada, they were American and Swedish officials. But so they got 2 exhibition games lined up against the Swedish national team. And they don't mean very much, except it's a chance to, for the team to make these adjustments. But also they're feeling something at this point, and you can't leave the emotional factor out. As I know you guys all know, playing hockey, the emotional factor is a big part of the game, and it affects how well you play. And what the Canadians are feeling at this point is rejection, abandonment. You know, they feel that they're being shunned by their own countrymen. The people that they've been playing for, the country they've been representing, has said they're a bunch of bums. You know, that they didn't live up to everybody's dreams of what they would do. And the reason they didn't was that the Soviet team is just so much better than anybody realized. You know, they're feeling like, you know, we're not really playing for Canada anymore. We're playing for ourselves. You know, we're Ron Ellis of the Toronto Maple Leafs, one of the players I interviewed, said we felt like it was us now against the world. It was 50 guys, because that was the number of people in the Canadian contingent with all the assistants and everything, the trainers. 50 guys against the world was how they saw it. And so in Sweden, here they were. Most of these guys had never been abroad before. You know, they'd been to the States. They played in the States. They played in Canada, but they'd never been to Europe, many of them. And it was a new experience for them. And they went out together to eat. They went out for a beer after the game. Their wives or girlfriends weren't there, so they just had each other for company. And they began to get to know each other and to bond. They really began to bond because they felt this common bond of being rejected and humiliated, really, by their own people. And also, you've got to remember, they all came from different teams. They were all used to hating each other's guts. And you know, there were players from just about every team in the NHL on this squad. And it takes time, obviously, for an all-star team like that to begin to unite and to, you know, to play together with that kind of sixth sense that you need about how to anticipate and what to expect from the other guys. And so these Swedish exhibition games were good for that, but so was the time itself, just the 10 days or so that they spent, or the week, I guess, they spent in Stockholm.
Which is, you mentioned wives and girlfriends, because it almost derailed the series, because there was a promise made, and I think most of the Canadian players that signed on to this felt, okay, this will be fun, exhibition series, play for our country, plus we get a little vacation out of it too, and we'll get to bring our wife or our girlfriend to the Soviet Union, and that just about didn't happen, and it made the players really mad.
Yeah, it didn't happen because, I mean, there had been an understanding that when they got to Moscow, their wives and girlfriends would join them. But the Soviet hockey authorities decided that was not a good idea, that they would have to say, oh, I'm sorry, you can't do that. And it was probably just another attempt, at least in the Canadians' minds, to throw them off their game, to rattle them, to upset them. And Alan Eagleson, who was the general manager, was ready to say okay to the Soviets. So in negotiating the various things that he had to negotiate, he was willing to give that one up. And when the players heard that, they had a private meeting, and they decided that they would tell Eagleson they had to have their wives and girlfriends over there in Moscow, or they simply would not play the remaining games in Russia. And that was another moment when Esposito, he kind of convened this team meeting. He asked Eagleson, Sinden, and Ferguson to leave the room, and he got the guys to agree to that. And again, they felt, okay, we're standing up for ourselves, and something that we really want. So the Canadian management gave in, and they told the Russians, sorry, we got to change that. And so the players won a victory, one of the many little victories that they had to win off the ice in order to feel better about playing on the ice.
One of the interesting parts of this story is as soon as, and again, from where you started, this is communist versus free world, two very different political systems. There is a lot of there's no trust between either nation or either hockey team. No. And from the time Canada arrives, what is perceived at least is some games are being played. Phone calls in the middle of the night, nobody on the end of the call. The beer and steaks that were brought in for the Canadians go missing.
Now that was serious.
Yeah, very serious. But a lot of things like this are happening, and Frank Mahovlich in particular is really paranoid about what is going on. Players think their rooms are being bugged. Wayne Cashman rips a mirror off the wall and throws it out the window. A lot of crazy stuff happening.
Well, yeah, maybe the guys had been watching too many spy movies, but they were convinced that the KGB was watching them. And Frank Mahovlich, who was a terrific hockey player and later became a senator, I don't mean an Ottawa senator, I mean a member of the Senate in Ottawa. Mahovlich, his family was from Croatia, and they had, which was behind the Iron Curtain, and so he was especially sensitive to the idea of Soviet perfidy. And at one point, I remember Serge Savard told me, he was the great Montreal Canadiens defenseman, told me when I interviewed him that Mahovlich said, you know what I think we should do? We should be like Napoleon when he attacked Moscow. We should set up our camp outside the city and not take rooms in the hotel. And Savard said, gee, Frank, why should we do that? And he said, well, because then, then they won't be able to spy on us if we have our own camp, out in the woods somewhere. And but if we stay at the hotel, our rooms will be bugged. And it was that kind of thinking. And so the guys, though, just generally did believe that they were bugged, and they would go through the room and look behind the mirrors and inside the lights and everything to see if they could find any little devices. And in one case, and this may have been Phil Esposito and Wayne Cashman, although they denied it, but they pulled up the rug, and sure enough, in the floor, there was a device like maybe that metal circle that's on the floor, something that looked like that, a metal circle, and they were convinced that was a listening device, and the KGB were listening with their headphones on somewhere in Moscow. So they thought, we'll dismantle it. And they got a Canadian quarter out of their pockets to use as a screwdriver, and they undid all the bolts in this thing. And when the last bolt came out, they heard a crash down below in the room below. And that had been a device that was holding a chandelier in the ceiling of the room underneath. And this really happened. The mirror story was that Wayne Cashman, who couldn't play in Moscow because he'd had his tongue so badly cut in the one of the exhibition games in Sweden. One of the Swedish players had speared him with the end of his stick in the mouth, and his tongue was slit open, and he had to have 52 stitches to close this horrible wound. And he had to be fed intravenously for a while because he couldn't eat. But nevertheless, Cashman was there with his wife, and he was healing up at this point. And he became convinced that the mirror concealed a listening device. So he tore it off the wall and carried it to the window and threw it down onto the sidewalk. And so Mrs. Cashman then had to go next door to the Esposito's room to put her makeup on.
So Game 5, Canada actually plays really, really well. They have a 4-1 lead in the third period.
The first game in Moscow.
Yeah, first game in Moscow. Soviets are leading the series, 2 wins, 1 loss, 1 tie. And Canada's up 4-1 in the third. And Harry Sinden, John Ferguson, really happy with the way they're playing. But the wheels come off. And so let's just have a quick look at a clip here. This is Vladimir Bikulov scoring the game winner, a 5-4 Soviet win.
Tony Esposito just saved the game right there for Canada. It looked like a sure goal, trapped completely out of the net. He got the stick back down right on the corner of the post as the Soviet player tried to come around the net and tuck it in the corner. 4-4 tie with 5:41 left in the game as the Soviets get a draw. Their hands-off shot wide. It drilled up on the left side. Henderson couldn't get past center.
Karloff played it back to his defense. Tearing over on the left side, and the Soviet passing is good. The drive is wide of the net. Recovered by Clark. Clark is off. Got it back in his own zone. The Soviet recovered. Got it right out. Goal! It's over!
So total frustration there by Tony Esposito, a 4-1 lead down the tubes. He played well in that game, but they end up losing 5-4. Just before we go a little bit deeper on that, you'll notice the cutting out of the transmission. It was quite a technological marvel that they were able to get those games from the Soviet Union back to Canada, but there were dropouts all game with the signal.
It was a satellite signal, of course.
And it had several stops in between before it actually got back to Canada. And these games, most of them were midday in Canada.
Yes. Yes, you either watched them on TV or listened to them on the radio, depending on where you were. And it would be like lunchtime or early afternoon. And it would be evening in Russia. Canada really looked like it was going to win that first game in Moscow, which would have evened up the series, because they were ahead 4-1 at the 5-minute mark of the third period. So with only 15 minutes to go, they're leading 4-1. They've really played a much more concerted, consistent game. They've been forechecking. They started to learn some of the teamwork of the Russians has been kind of rubbing off on them, and they're really looking good. What the Soviets do is score 4 goals in less than 6 minutes, and that was one of the features of those Soviet teams, is that they could just explode and score in bunches, and you could never count them out. So suddenly a 4-1 game becomes a 5-4 game in 6 minutes. So that was pretty hard to take. And Sinden was so broken up that he actually left the bench and went to the dressing room before the game ended, leaving Ferguson out front. And he went in and he saw the teacups, because they were served tea in the coach's dressing room on the table, picked up one of the china cups and threw it at the wall.
And now Canada is really in a hole. There's no way out of this series except 3 consecutive wins, which actually is the way this thing ends up. They're down significantly in the series, and now there's dissension. So you've got players that haven't been playing a lot, and 4 of them leave the team, including the biggest name there, Vic Hadfield, who was a star with the New York Rangers.
Yeah, well, Hadfield was maybe not a name that you remember much today, but he was a big goal scorer for the New York Rangers in those days, and he was just so pissed off at being either kept on the bench or kept even out of uniform. He finally, at practice, he just sort of sat down and said, I'm not even going to practice if you're not going to play me. And Sinden said to him, well, that makes us feel kind of funny, It makes us feel kind of stupid. You having one of our guys not taking part in the practice, and the Soviet coaches and players are up there watching us practice, and you're sitting on the bench. Maybe you should go home. And he did. And 3 others also went, younger players, less prominent than Hadfield.
But became good players. Rick Martin, Gilbert Perreault, Jocelyn Gavrima, all ended up with Buffalo.
Sinden felt relieved when they left. He felt that they were that those players were malcontents and were spreading a kind of malaise, within the team, and that it was better to have them gone, better to have all the guys stay who wanted to stay, who wanted to play, whether they were getting into action or not. They called them the Black Aces, the ones who didn't get in the games but stuck around for practice. And some of those guys never got into a game. Brian Glennie of the Maple Leafs, who later coached my son in Toronto, he didn't play at all. And Mickey Redmond, I think, only played 1 game.
Game 1 in Montreal.
A few others like that. But the situation now is in order to win the series, they have to win each of the remaining 3 games. I mean, this is a very tall order, and it's very hard for those of us at home to believe that they can do that. You know, they just haven't shown themselves yet able to handle this team, because in 5 games they've only won 1. You know, it really looks bad.
And one of the ingredients to success is John Ferguson saying to Bobby Clark, young center for the Philadelphia Flyers, tough guy, played for Fred Shero's Broad Street Bullies, go out and break Valerie Harlamov's ankle. He literally said it. You talked to him. Ferguson confirmed it.
I talked to John Ferguson, and you know, Bobby Clark had always said, nobody told me to do it. Bobby Clark, I guess, didn't want to pin the rap on Ferguson, but Ferguson told me, yeah, I took Bobby aside and I said, look, this Kharlamov guy is killing us. You've got to do something about him. We've got to put him out of action. Just do what you have to do. And are we going to watch that?
We're going to watch it.
Okay.
So this is what, and this is interesting because Foster Hewitt and Brian Conacher don't pick up on this as you watch the play. Watch Clark go from center ice following Harlamov. And this is your classic two-hander. Have a look.
And the goal was unassisted, as was Henderson's, which was a fairly long shot. The Afghans scored from Yakushev for the Soviets, the first score of the game, and at 2:12, all the scoring in the second period. 3-1 for Canada as the puck goes back to Raglan, number 5.
While we're setting it up, because I've just set up the crew, just talk a little bit more about the Henderson situation and how he really blossoms in this series.
Well, Henderson was one of, I guess, 2 Canadian players who wore a helmet. And he was spilled into the boards very heavily by a Soviet player, spun him around and dumped him, and he slid backwards into the boards earlier in this game.
Yes.
And hit the boards with the back of his head and his shoulders. And probably it was only the helmet that saved him, really, that saved him from having a very severe concussion. As it was, he was unconscious for a while, and it took a lot of smelling salts to bring him back. He was taken to the dressing room, and he was told by the team doctor that he shouldn't play anymore, that he might have a slight concussion, and he better not play anymore. And he was brokenhearted, Henderson. He started to cry. And he said to Harry Sinden, "Coach, you've got to let me play. You've got to let me play." And Sinden said, "Okay, Paul, it's up to you. You make the choice. If you want to play, you'll play." And he did. He came back and scored that goal. The same game.
Yeah, how different the game is now. He would have never played and would not be a Canadian hockey icon had he not. So let's try this again. Here's the Bobby Clark slash on Valerie Harlamov. Well, we're still looking for it. So we'll keep talking about Paul Henderson.
Here's something else, Jamie, that's significant that we haven't mentioned. There were 3,000 Canadian fans who were able to get the tickets. Canada was given 3,000 tickets to sell, and the 3,000 they were snapped up very, very quickly. And those 3,000 lucky people went over to Moscow and stayed in the in-tourist hotel and went to all the games. They sat together as a block in the crowd and made more noise than any Russian arena had ever heard. It was the custom of the Russians to just watch quietly, and they always kept a very kind of grim, stoical manner. It was considered impolite or even dangerous to shout in public, or it just was not the Russian thing to do. And the Canadian fans, they had noisemakers, they had trumpets, they had Canadian flags, and the Soviet fans just couldn't believe their eyes, the way these Canadians behaved. They were such fanatical fans, and they did a tremendous amount for the team's spirit. They began to feel, they love us after all. They really raised the morale of the team. And the other thing that helped a lot was there were thousands of telegrams sent to the
Yes.
team, and they papered these telegrams all over their dressing room, wishing them well in the Moscow games.
One other thing we haven't talked about is the officiating, particularly Botter and Campella, two referees that the Canadians did not like.
Yes, they were both West Germans actually, and but they were sanctioned international referees, but they were refereeing under international rules, where you could hardly touch a guy without getting a penalty. So they were calling a lot of penalties on the Canadians that they didn't feel were deserved. And their names were Botter and Kampala, and the Canadians called them Botter and worse. And but Sinden and Ferguson actually said to their Soviet counterparts, we can't have these guys refereeing any more games. They've got to go and use other referees. And there was a Swede who was okay, and there was a Czech who was okay. Let's use those. Well, this becomes a big deal in game 7 and 8. You want to talk about that now?
Yeah, let's go ahead. So, and that is, you're right, because Canada wins game 6, as we said, the 3-2 win. They win again in game 7, and then the gamemanship starts again before game 8.
So the Soviet hockey authorities had agreed not to let Botter and Kampala referee any more games, but they changed their minds for game 8, because at this point the Canadians were only one win away from winning the series. Because after game 7, the series was all tied up. 3 wins apiece, 1 tie. So game 8 was like the rubber match. That would settle it. So the Soviets suddenly decided that Botter and Worse had to be the referees for that game. And as the host team, they had the right to decide. So there was serious consideration by Eagleson and Sinden and Ferguson of just refusing to play. If they had to play with those guys who they felt were so biased against them, they would just refuse to play, and that would be like, that was the highest card they had to play in negotiating some improvement. So eventually the Soviets said, okay, we'll choose one referee and you choose one. So the Soviets chose Kampala, and the Canadians chose the Swede. Oh, we're sorry to tell you, the Swede is come down with the flu. He can't referee. Okay, well then they said that in that case we'll nominate our second choice, who was the Czech, Rudy Bata. So when game 8 started, the Canadians noticed there was a Swedish referee up in the stands looking perfectly healthy.
And the Soviets also manipulated the crowd. They didn't like the fact that there was a big contingent of Canadian fans in one section of the arena.
That's right. So once they saw how rowdy and noisy the Canadians were, they decided they were a possible threat to public order. And they brought in police, uniformed police, to line the aisle at ice level. So anybody coming in or going out had to pass through this police line. And it was very weird watching it on TV, because they looked more like soldiers. They were in military-style uniforms, and they were shoulder to shoulder along the boards, all the way around the rink. It was the weirdest thing you've ever seen at a hockey game.
We're still trying to get some clips arranged here, but Paul Henderson scores the game winner. We saw that just a few minutes ago in game 6. Game 7, arguably the most beautiful goal he ever scored in his career. And it's a game winner as well.
We've got to see that one.
Oh, I hope we will. I hope we will.
Yeah. Those last 3 games, each of which Canada had to win, they all ended as 1-goal games. There was only one game in which Canada had a wider margin than one, and that was game 2 in Toronto when they won 4-1. So, and of course, Henderson was the man in every case. He scored 3 game winners in a row.
And going into Game 8, the Russians now start to talk about, because just in case Canada wins or the last game starts, or sorry, finishes in a tie, they start again playing games and saying, well, total goals versus goals for and goals against, we're going to claim victory.
Yeah, the Soviets, this was actually in the middle of Game 8, I think right at the end of the second period. And the Soviets informed the Canadians that, oh, by the way, if this game ends in a tie, then the series will be completely tied, but we will claim victory on goals differential, because that's the way it's done in international hockey. And Eagleson blew a stack, and Sinden did too. They just, it was just one more fast one they felt that the Soviets had tried to put over on them. But Eagleson was a little, as we'll see when we get to Game 8, was really over the top by this time.
Okay, I think we might have the Bobby Clark slash, if I'm reading the signals correctly from the crew. If we do, can we roll that now, please?
Henderson's goal was unassisted, as was Henderson.
Canada's now in white, of course.
The Afton scored from Yakushev for the Soviets, the first score of the game, and at 2:12, all the scoring in the second period. 3-1 for Canada as the puck goes back to Raglan, number 5. They're 5 aside, both teams a man short.
Watch Bobby Clark put the blue line in.
Center ice. Harlamov passes back. Here's the roller in front, a shot. Knocked down by Berkman, who fell in front of it. And there's going to be a penalty, I believe.
Harlamov is 17. So he's still able to skate.
Soviet player shoved him in. Now Berkman goes over to the Soviet player. Threatens him a bit. That's Harlamov and Berkman.
Harlamov is only 5'6" and 155 pounds.
So that's a vicious slash. Not the greatest moment in Canadian hockey history, but from the perspective at that moment in time, from the coaching staff, Bobby Clark did his job.
Yeah, that's right. That's how Ferguson saw it, and he said, you know, they just weren't as good a team anymore without Harlamov.
And Harlamov doesn't play in Game 7. He does come back for Game 8, but he's not effective.
No, his leg is shot full of painkiller for Game 8, and yeah, he doesn't have the same speed or mobility at all.
We promised Paul Henderson's goal. This is Paul Henderson, for those who don't know the Henderson story, started his career with the Detroit Red Wings, traded to the Toronto Maple Leafs in a blockbuster deal, had a couple of good seasons in Toronto, culminating with the Canada-Soviet Summit Series, where he became a national hero. After that, injury trouble, and he just couldn't take the pressure. He got out of the NHL and went to the WHA and ended up in Birmingham.
Birmingham, Alabama, which had a WHA team called the Bulls.
Which was actually the Toronto Toros and was relocated to Birmingham. So we won't go any more down that road of WHA NHL hockey history.
No.
But here is an absolutely beautiful goal. The game winner from Game 7, 4-3, Canada wins. Paul Henderson scores the goal.
Here's a mix-up here. Over on that far side, Phil Esposito.
Oh, this is Phil Esposito's antics before the Henderson goal.
To the Soviet player.
You'll enjoy this.
Who waved him away. It was Mihailov, and Phil Esposito is going to get a penalty as a result. Whatever Esposito said to him, Mihailov didn't seem to understand or didn't care anyway. 7:21 left in the first period.
The Russian fans whistle. That's their, instead of booing, they whistle.
12:39 is the time of the penalty. Canada's lost the advantage. Cross-checking penalty.
So remember, there's a language barrier. So that's Espo's way of saying, I'll see you in the parking lot after the game. But it's comical to watch that. I don't know what to say to that.
Yeah, it didn't seem comical at the time, somehow. Even if you're a rabid Canadian fan, as we all were, there were some embarrassing moments. I think that was one of them.
Yes, I would agree. It's,
you know, it was. I mean, Esposito had a theatrical side to him, and you know, sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't.
the other thing that's funny about that is Esposito was not really a fighter. He didn't get in a lot of fights. He was paid to score goals, but anyways, he wasn't afraid to mix it up. Okay, the long-promised Paul Henderson clip of his goal in Game 7. I'm hoping that we can bring it up and show you it once and for all. And then, of course, we'll get to the goal that everybody remembers in Game 8 with 34 seconds left.
Two fairly fast goals, Dennis Hull and then Cardwyer and Berenson. And two of the three have been added starters. Now then, Canada coming up. It's going to go! Henderson! Let's go in a long drive.
That's the winner from Game 6 in the series. Game 7's winner is much prettier than that, and we will find it. And someone over in the production studio will let me know when we have it. But again, Henderson's really coming into his own. Like,
yeah.
And he wants more ice time. He's actually in Game 8 when he scores the winner. He's not even supposed to be on the ice. He pulled Peter Mahovlich off.
That's right. Well, we'll get to that. But Henderson was a man who had a tremendous amount of faith that he was going to play well. He was convinced that he had this goal in him each game, and he just was tremendously optimistic, tremendous spirit. I think he was a guy who helped to carry the team the way Esposito did, except in a different way. They were the two leading scorers for Canada in the series, and they were also probably the two most inspiring players.
And Henderson, of course, after he left hockey, actually before he left hockey, became a very religious man and has had a ministry that has done very, very well, and of course, living off the legacy of his game-winning goal in the series.
Yeah. He's had led a Christian ministry for athletes and professional men in Toronto for some time. I don't know how he is now. He had a very serious bout with cancer a few years ago, but I think he went into remission.
Do we have Game 7's game winner by Paul Henderson? I'm just checking in to see if we can roll it. If we can, please do. And then we'll get to the final game in the series, Game 8, and wrap this up.
Going down, got to the defense, goes right in the score!
You're just seeing the end of that. Unfortunately.
If we can go back about 20 seconds, it would be great.
They're going to try to do that for us because it is a tremendous goal. He splits the defense and he's kind of tilted sideways and he lifts it up high and he beats Treček. And it's an absolutely beautiful goal that wins Game 7. Game 8, I just want to talk about one thing that I think people probably have questions about. When Henderson scores with 34 seconds remaining in the game, there's a shot. If that's ready to roll, go ahead and we'll bring it in. They're still trying to get it queued up. Apologize, folks. Sometimes technology doesn't work the way you want it to. But in Game 8, there it is. So you saw a bit of that as he's kind of weaving his way through the defense. It's just an absolutely gorgeous goal.
He's dragged down. He's being dragged down by the Russian defenseman from behind. And he's actually falling as he shoots.
It's funny, too, because he's here we go. Here's the replay. You get to see it all here.
Here he goes around them.
That's a nice goal. Very pretty goal, and he's always said, why couldn't that have been the one that I won the series with, not the garbage goal that is so famous? That's his words.
Here it is again, I think, maybe.
It is.
Yeah.
Pretty nice goal. So that's Paul Henderson's game winner. I was going to say before we show Game 8, the one that everybody knows, at the end of the game, Pat Stapleton, Chicago Blackhawks defenseman, played the entire series, is seen picking up the puck. And this happens, 34 seconds, after Henderson scored the goal. Puck wasn't changed, so we have to believe that is the puck that was used.
That's right.
And years later, the question remains, where is the puck for the series-winning goal?
Yeah.
And you went to see Pat Stapleton. Tell that story.
Yeah, I made a point of interviewing him in person because I wanted to ask, you know, what did he do with the puck? Because in the game film, you can see him. The Canadian players are all hugging each other, and Stapleton, instead, he was a defenseman for the Blackhawks, he goes over and he picks up the puck and he's got it in his glove. That's the last we ever see of it, and it was the puck with which Henderson had scored. So I drove out, this is 25 years later. I wrote this book, by the way, for the 25th anniversary of the series. It actually came out the year before, but the 25th anniversary was 1997. We're now at the 45th anniversary. So this book is almost 20 years old. But it still was written far enough after the series was over that, you know, that you had a perspective on how big that series had been, how much it had counted for, and what changes it had brought to hockey. And anyway, so at this point, Stapleton is a farmer. He's running a farm near Strathroy, Ontario, which is near Sarnia. And he's been coaching minor league hockey, and he's a very gregarious, outgoing, friendly guy. And he invited me for lunch, so I drove out to his farm and finally brought the conversation around to that puck. And I said, do you still have it, Mr. Stapleton? Do you still, or Pat, he called him Pat. Do you still have it, Pat? Do you still, you know, do you have a little shrine for it? Oh, he said, I guess that would be a good idea, wouldn't it? He said, I could build a nice little shrine in the barn there and have the puck, and all the cattle could go and kneel down in front of it. Well, I said, so you do have it? Well, he said, I'm not saying I do. I'm not saying I don't. But, you know, if I did have it, he said, what I'd really like to do with it is take it to Ottawa and just throw it out on the Rideau Canal and, you know, bat it up and down the canal. That'd be fun. And then maybe after I did that, I would present it to the government and say, you know, why don't you set it up on a you know, in a plexiglass box in the foyer of the House of Commons. I said, well, yeah, you could, that's an idea, or you could give it to the Hockey Hall of Fame, said I. Oh, he said, that's another good idea. Yeah. He said, well, you're full of ideas about what I could do with it, aren't you? And so I said, you're not going to show it to me, are you? He said, no, I'm not. And so I left. We left on good terms. In fact, I left promising to send him my VHS tape of Game 8. Which I had bought. I'd bought the whole series from the CBC, and he didn't. He said, "You know, I've never seen the film of that game. I'd love to see it." And I said, "Oh well, you should certainly see it. I'll lend you the tape." So I mailed him the tape. I've never seen it since.
It's with the puck.
It's with the puck.
Do you think he has? Do you think he has the puck?
I think he probably does. But I think he has my tape too. But I kind of think that's okay. Like, better he should have it than me. I mean, he was there, you know. He was there, and he was a difference maker in that series. He and Bill White, his defense pairing.
If Bobby Clark's slash Phil Esposito's antics in the penalty box are bad, this particular clip from J.P. Parise of the Minnesota North Stars really does not do Canada's hockey reputation well. This is in Game 8 after he's penalized for a trip that he doesn't think is a trip.
Well, and not only that, but the game 8 starts with Kampala calling penalty after penalty after penalty against Canada, and you know, it's just like Canada's worst nightmare come true.
And so
then Parise, as you say, gets one of them, and
yeah, and this is what he does.
Esposito out there with Parise as the puck goes back to Mikolov.
This is Zach Parise's father, of course.
There's the penalty right there that he's angry about. In today's NHL, that's a penalty.
Canada. And just one penalty after another in this game. Reese knocked the Soviet player over, seemed to get the elbow into it, and as a result will get an elbowing penalty, and Canada will play 2 men short. The Soviet won. Reese is...
Now that was a replay. I guess that's a penalty.
Yeah, I think it's a penalty. But watch what happens with Parise.
He goes into the penalty box, then he comes out again. 32.
He has no respect for the referees. He could get himself right up the game.
He just skates around. He's boiling. He's boiling. He's losing it.
In this type of situation, because it's a close checking game, each player
It gets better. Wait.
sure that his man, his responsibility.
There's Kampala over there, the referee on the left.
There's a lot of hooking, tripping, and so on.
Needless to say, he was ejected from the game.
Parise is totally incensed at this call. And he is tempted to swing his stick at the referee on a couple of occasions. And I think he's going to talk himself right out of this game.
And that's Harry Sinden on the bench, the head coach of Canada. And this discussion keeps going for a while, but at the end of the day, Parise's night is over.
Stapleton is the guy with the blonde hair, by the way. Just showing. Maybe they'll show Sinden throwing the chair on the ice.
That's part of this clip, I think. But it's interesting. You might have heard the announcer say, Brian Conacher, a very questionable call. That was hockey in 1972. You could do that. You could interfere with a player and not be penalized. And as you said, this is bubbling over from call after call after call against Canada in Game 8. Here it is again. Again, today's NHL, that's a penalty.
Sure.
Puck is long gone. But you're right, Harry Sinden blows a fuse here and ends up throwing a bench, I think, or a stool off the bench onto the ice, and the talk continues. And
that's Sinden.
And look at Sinden's gestures,
the red tie,
throat slashing, which is
you can see the police along the boards there, by the way.
And the other thing that amazes me about this is how long the delays are.
Yeah.
There'd be some sort of penalty, and there'd be this long dispute that goes on and on and on.
Millions of people around the world are watching this. Not just in Canada, not just in Russia, but all over the world. It's a very big international sporting event. And
by the way, that's also Alan Eagleson. If you don't know who he is, there he is on the bench with the Canadians at this point. And he's right involved. And there's another clip coming up of Alan Eagleson kind of getting himself in the soup a little bit later with some fan and military involvement. And we'll go to that clip in just a few minutes. We'll ask them to cue it up. And this comes after Canada's trailing in this game, and they tie it up. And right after they tie it up, Alan Eagleson, as I said, gets into some conflict with some people in the stands. And this is kind of what happens. So if we can roll the clip of the tying goal in Game 8 before Henderson scores. Here it is.
Mishakov, a center, knocked the puck back to the Canadian goal. Park is trying to come out on the left side. A long pass to Phil Esposito going in. He shoots. Oh, right in front of the net. Esposito banged that. Here's another shot by Cornwallier. His goal! Canada have tied it up. The Canadian team grabbing each other there as the loose puck went around the net.
So that ties it.
Canada tied it finally.
Tied it at 5. It ended up being a 6-5 game.
Makes an incredible individual effort on this goal. I can't say enough. Look at him fight for the puck. He gets it back out in front of the net after having missed it.
Yvan Cornwallier.
And I believe it's Yvan
who the Russians helped nickname the Roadrunner from this series. Because of his speed for the Montreal Canadiens. But right after this, coming up here in just a few seconds, right here, here's Eagleson getting tangled in and the Canadians going to his defense.
The reason Eagleson has come down from his seat to the boards is that the red light didn't go on on Cornwallier's goal. And Eagleson was convinced that the Russians were not going to allow it. That they were, again, they were going to steal the game from Canada. There's Eagleson. Peter Mohovlich has just rescued him from the Soviet soldiers, and they're escorting him across the ice. Now look what he does.
Yeah, the hand gestures, again, not good moments for Canada. That's Canada's trainer.
The president and prime minister of the Soviet Union are in the crowd, and I think that he was giving the finger in their direction.
It's bizarre. You know, you look at this 45 years ago, and it's really, again, you have to think about the political context of this story and just we versus them, communism versus free world. But right now, the free world doesn't look really good.
No, it's another embarrassing moment. You know, and they should be playing hockey, which they do very well. I mean, Canada has come back from a 5-3 deficit to tie the game at 5 in the third period, and you know, I mean, this is the game they have to win. And at the end of the second, they were down by 2 goals, 5-3, and they apparently the players I interviewed told me that, you know, in the dressing room leading up to that last period, there was no panic, there was no hysteria. The players, at least, were calm. The players were saying, you know, we can still take this one, we can still win it. Henderson was convinced, Esposito was convinced. They really believed they could do it. And so they went out, Esposito closed the gap to 1, and then Cournoyer tied it. It's 5-5.
5-5, and again, just one other little footnote before we show the goal that everybody remembers. The Ontario government makes an extraordinary move here and says to schools across the province, let the kids watch Game 8, because it's a weekday,
That's right.
It's middle of the day game. So just remember that when you think about what you just watched. Jean-Paul Parise, hand gestures that aren't exactly appropriate, and school children going as low as grade 1, watching their Canadian hockey heroes.
It's kind of a universal experience for people of that generation who were in school, public or high school, in Ontario in 1972. They were allowed to go to usually to the gymnasium or the auditorium where TV set was set up, and somehow, you know, hundreds of kids would crane their necks and peer over each other's heads trying to watch the game.
And this is what they remember. This is the goal. Perhaps Canada's most famous goal. Paul Henderson's winner, 34 seconds left.
Shot, the defenseman fell over, Liatkin, and the Cournoyer has it on that wing. Here's a shot.
Henderson falls behind the net, and then he comes back out.
Here's another shot, right by the score. Henderson has scored for Canada. Henderson right in front of the net. And the fans of the team are going wild. Henderson.
This is another interesting thing, how all of the players, and this happens not only in this game-winning goal, everybody exits the bench. Nowadays, that would be a minor penalty for delay a game. And look at this, there's another fine Canadian moment as we salute the crowd. But that was Bill Goldsworthy, I think, who was a player who wasn't dressed for most of the series, but got his moment on television there. And Canada wins it 6-5, and they go home victorious in an absolutely incredible series, one for the ages.
Well, yeah, and it was so unexpected how it turned out. First, it was unexpected that we fell so far behind, and then it seemed amazing that we could come from so far behind and you know, playing in the enemy's home rink, you know, under his rules with his referees, and still pull out a victory in the very last minute.
Well, Roy, thank you for writing the book. Cold War is a great name for it. Again, the hockey and political connection and the tension that was involved. Wonderful book.
Thank you very much. And it's more than a series. And the way I try to finish the book is to suggest a few of the ways that this series really changed hockey, because it changed the way we play the game and the way we practice and stay in shape. And it opened up the NHL to international players from from Europe and from Russia.
Roy MacSkimming, author of Cold War on the 1972 Canada-Soviet Summit Series, Reliving Hockey History. Thanks for watching. I'm Jamie Bramburger. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, Jamie.
Thank you. It's great. It's great.